My name is Cheryl Cardinal. I am from the Second Creek Cree Nation in northern Alberta. I also have family ties to Unama'ki and Sartlip in BC on Vancouver Island. I am the President CEO of the Indigenous Center of Energy. So we essentially ensure that Indigenous voices are at all tables. I have an Indigenous Advisory Committee from Australia, New Zealand, United States, and Canada, which focus on oil and gas, mining, international trade, climate change, sustainability, and renewable energy. So basically my strategic direction comes from Indigenous people for Indigenous people. We do that through a couple of ways. So we work with energy companies to help understand how to work with Indigenous people. We work with Indigenous people to help them understand energy and make informed decisions. I also do an Indigenous Conference on Energy and Mining, which brings together Indigenous people from around the world to talk about issues that are important to us. And in these discussions, we make sure to include the energy leaders in renewable energy, mining, oil and gas, as well as domestic and foreign governments. I think probably the best way to look at it is nationally. So when it comes to resource development in this country, that is often a provincial jurisdiction. And so you have provincial responsibilities for off-reserve development. So each province and region differs in accordance to how it deals with its First Nations people. It also gets to be interesting once you talk about on-reserve development, because then that triggers the federal jurisdiction for First Nations and Indians and lands reserved for Indians. So it gets to be interesting in the sake that we have a special regulating agency, Indian Oil and Gas, which focuses on reserve development. And as you go across the country, it gets even more complex and more exciting because of the variety of opportunities that our people have when it comes to resource development. We're in 2017, we've got the approvals from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for Line 3 and Kinder Morgan. And we sit here and we look at what he's saying and what he's doing and talking about that no relationship is more important than that with its Indigenous people. And he's put it in all the mandate letters with all of his ministers. So we sit here and we start to try and understand, well, what does that mean for our people? What does that mean for engagement in some of these sectors? We have a lot of band-owned companies who are in resource-rich areas that can benefit immediately from a lot of these. So they've got consultation and accommodation dollars, they get a lot of agreements and partnerships opportunities that work with them. Sometimes we get employment and training opportunities that go depending on where the development is and what company it is as well. So we have a variety of perspectives. There isn't one way that First Nations are dealt with in this country. There isn't one way that resource development is really looked at and one way that we've gone down this path. You have offshore drilling, you have pipelines, you have upstream, midstream, and downstream. So how can we start making sure that First Nations are there? And some of the ways that through my company, what I always talk about is having First Nations or Indigenous people at the VP, the President, CEO, and Board of Director levels. Where better to have our voice than at some of these companies? Where better can we have some of these discussions than in the government regulations? So you start looking at what the National Energy Board is doing in the sense that they're looking at a co-management style, since Trudeau has talked about no relationship is more important than that with Indigenous people. But they don't quite know what the co-management process will look like. And so they're in the process of talking to all the First Nations that are impacted by the Kinder Morgan line, all the First Nations that are impacted by the Line 3 expansion project that they have going on, and saying, well, we want First Nations, we want Indigenous people to be participating in this process. But they themselves as the National Energy Board don't quite know what that participation or how that'll all look. I think we need to kind of examine the history of First Nations in this country. We look at the legislation and everything that is over our people. And up until the 1960s, we weren't able to lobby the government based on the legislation that was around us. And so the same goes for oil and gas development. When you look at Indian Oil and Gas Canada and the fact that they're a special regulating agency under Indian Affairs, some of the things that we start looking at and what becomes interesting is that IOGC is the one who takes the royalties on our behalf and puts it into a trust fund for our people. Currently, the way it stands is that we're not allowed to take those dollars and reinvest them into something that the government deems too risky. So the government has an overarching hand over where we can take our trust money and reinvest it into our own people or our own communities. With that being said, we're slowly migrating towards an area where there are more opportunities, there are more partnerships, there are more employment. And so a lot of this stuff that I discuss is about employment and training. How can we get our people employed, not just at a laborer position, but all the way up to the top? How can we make sure that our voices there is a ladder for us and we're not just stuck at the bottom, which is historically how it's been. How can we make sure that we're the one who are making sure that we're stewards of the environment and that the projects don't cause a lot of harm to our lands and to our traditional territories? And so when we start going through this migration and this movement, you've got the co-management through the National Energy Board, you've got our voices being included, and I don't think quite yet they know how that voice will be there. But we've got business opportunities where we've created band-owned companies, at least here in the West, where we're able to start capitalizing and owning those leases and permits on our communities. So when you start looking at some communities such as Frog Lake, for example, they've got the Frog Lake Energy Resource Corporation, which they do their own development on their land. You've got Onion Lake Energy, which is also within the SAGD process. So oil sands, but a little bit further down the ground, so that they can start participating in some of this. And so what some of these communities have done is incorporate our elders, our youth, look at the direction that the community wants to take, and how can we start looking at where we want our communities to go towards the future. You start looking at what's happening in the oil sands with Fort McKay and Mikisew, who have recently signed a partnership with Suncor Energy. And a lot of the stuff that they're looking at is creating opportunities for Fort McKay and for Mikisew to really engage in the oil sands business. And so you start talking about billion-dollar companies, then you start talking about the entrepreneurs and the businesses that have been created from specific band members to start engaging in the oil and gas sector. So we're at a really exciting time in the sense. We're also at a building time because the price of oil and gas is very cyclical, so it goes up and down. We're in a down period now, which is a perfect opportunity for our people to start building, to start looking at the future of what we want, and then being engaged for when the price goes back up so that we can maximize our benefit to resource development in this country. So an impact benefit agreement is essentially a way that energy companies come and provide benefits back to the community, I guess, is a nice, simple way of putting it. We've got, these are predominantly done more in BC, so British Columbia has a lot of impact benefit agreements. Slowly, people are starting to move away from impact benefit agreements, so it also depends where you are in the country. So when you start talking about what's happening in Nova Scotia, for example, you've got community benefits agreements, you've got, impact benefit agreements is something when you start looking at the mining sector and the Ring of Fire and things that are happening there. So it's impacts to that the project will bring on to the First Nations in the area. I think a lot of the stuff that people need to start looking at is where are we going with resource development in this country? Because we have, on one hand, the federal government looking at us saying, we want you to manage this with us. You've got some First Nations on one hand saying, we want to protect the earth. We want to look at, we don't want the resources development, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's mining. We want to focus on things that'll be good for Mother Earth. We've got a wide variety of perspectives when it comes to Indigenous voices. And what is our communities going to do in that sense? So when we start talking about impact benefit agreements, we have some communities who are deeply impacted by these resource development that really don't want those developments to take place. So when we start looking at some of these things, consultation and accommodation is actually engaged when a lot of the resource development is in our traditional territories. And so oil and gas sector need to come and talk to us. And so when we start looking at some of the consultation and accommodation agreements that we have, the space for some of the stuff that we have. So, and that's triggered through the Supreme Court saying that when we start looking at the decisions that First Nations need to take when it comes to resource development, it triggers consultation and accommodation discussions. And so what each of those consultation and accommodation, again, that varies from nation to nation, province to province, and kind of the focus of where each of the communities are. You look at what's going on in Nova Scotia, and they've got a tripartite agreement where you have the provincial, federal government, and the First Nations together. And then you have a couple independent bands from that. You've got, you start looking at Alberta, for example, and a lot of our consultation and accommodation agreements vary depending on the First Nation that you're engaged with, and what does that look like. We've got our mapping of our traditional territories, and how does all of this engage in a lot of those discussions. And so it requires a lot of almost faith in provincial governments to make sure that we're being engaged at the right time. And historically, First Nations people have never had a great experience with government. And we could just look at our history and everything that we've been through, and the fact that we're the most studied people in this country. We've been studied to death, essentially. So how can we start making sure that when we're looking at these engagement processes, when we're looking at benefits to our things, a lot of this is done through when we're looking at consultation, it essentially becomes mitigating our Aboriginal and treaty rights. So what are we losing, and how can we start making sure that there's a value dollar, or that something that's put to it, right? The First Nations are actually the ones in negotiation for this. So when we start looking at a lot of the resource development, it gets to be interesting because we typically rely on a lot of lawyers and a lot of technical people to provide a lot of that assistance. In some cases, First Nations don't have the capacity to be negotiating these, but in some cases we're so sophisticated, we make sure that a lot of the development goes back to our communities. And so it really varies depending on the community that you're in, the relationship or knowledge that they have in the community, and how can we start kind of figuring out what is best and what we can do. So we have a lot of, sometimes it's negotiated through employment and training, sometimes recently, and it's only recently that we have equity positions in some of these projects, and that would be, the first equity thing that's been discussed that I'm really aware of is the Mikisew Fort McKay Suncor position. We had some discussion through an equity position through the Northern Gateway project, but as everybody is aware, that one was turned down based on environmental concerns. So a lot of the discussion that takes place is how can we start maximizing what's best for our communities. But it's also how can we start balancing a lot of the discussion that's taking place. Recently, as last week, I was in a discussion with First Nations nationally about energy and energy developments and where are we going to go. And you had a lot of First Nations that have a lot of variety of views, similar to Canadians. Some saying that we don't want resource development, we want to protect the environment, and we want to protect our traditional territories for our future generations. You have some communities that are very engaged in the oil and gas sector, in the mining sector, in renewables, in solar, in wind. And so how can we start looking at understanding this. A lot of the discussion that needs to take place is that every energy development actually has an impact to our environment. When we start looking at wind, it's got an impact to the birds, and sometimes sensitivity for people and hearing when the turbines are turning. With solar, we've got mercury that's in the solar panels, so it becomes disposal. And it's fantastic to have solar panels on the roofs for our elders or for some of our buildings. But if we're looking at solar farms, that takes up a considerable amount of land, and the impacts to our environment when it comes to that. You look at oil and gas development, we can talk about the impacts to possibly the water. So whether we're talking about groundwater contamination, whether we're talking about the amount of water that's used, the amount of water that's allocated when we start talking about the runoff of water, and how does all of this impact the environment, and what did they do with a lot of they put chemicals for fracking into the ground and disposals, and how does that all look? You look at pipelines and the fact that, we have our Prime Minister that's talking about, numerous times that pipeline is the safest way to transport oil and gas. But then you start looking at the impacts that pipelines could have, and the fact that pipelines don't last forever, so you need to replace those pipelines at one point. But what's the alternative that we have? We have the alternative of transporting oil and gas through either rail, and we look at what happened in Lake Megantic and the problem that we have there, in addition to the amount of trucks that would need to be transporting it out of specific areas that we have. We look at the resources that we have in this country, whether it is oil, gas, mining, or renewables, and where they take place. And it's within our traditional territories, and it's within impacts to our community, and how can we really start having this discussion? A lot of the discussion that's take place becomes almost it's an environment versus economics, but there's a whole bunch of more of spectrum that's in there other than just this dichotomy discussion where we're saying you're either for the environment or you're for the economics of the project. There's a lot of discussion that needs to take place from our communities as well as our leaders, our youth, to discuss, we always talk about youth being our future generation, and our elders having our history of our communities and our connection back to who we are as people. And so it becomes very challenging for where do we want to go from here. And I think that's where we're at, is a lot of the discussions, especially around resource development, whether we're looking at renewables, oil, gas, or mining, or where do we go from here? How do we start making sure that we're getting what we're owed, or what we should be getting, or we should be engaged, how we want to be engaged. And we've got the Supreme Court of Canada, we've got the Section 35 rights, we start looking at constitutional agreements and legislative processes that are on us. And how do we start reconciling all of this to figure out where we as Indigenous people, as First Nations, as communities want to go from here? And we're at an interesting time. I would love to say that we have one approach that works for all of us. But the fact is we have 634 First Nations across the country. Each one of us is going to take a different approach to what works for our communities. And sometimes we're going to agree and sometimes we're not. And I think we need to start figuring out and having that discussion amongst ourselves as to what we want to do and where we want to go. I guess one of the things that, I start looking at is that each of the energies that we talk about has innovation on ways that we can move forward. You start looking at solar and wind, and some of the challenges that they've faced in the past has been around how do they sustain themselves in the Canadian Arctic temperatures. And so, I've done talks and discussions with the Alaskans who are also looking and battling with the same discussions, and so they've created a testing place in Fairbanks, Alaska, to start looking at how some of these renewables react in a lot of in the Arctic temperatures. You start looking at some of the things that are happening in Norman Wells, for example, in the Northwest Territories, and previously they utilized the natural gas from Imperial, from the developments that were taking place there. Imperial kind of came back to them a couple of years ago and said, we're at an interesting time. We're recognizing that our natural gas supply for this area is going down a bit. So you need to start looking at alternative sources. And so in one way they went and they said, well, we looked at wood pellets as a way for heating for our homes, but then there was a shortage on wood pellets. So how do you start making sure that some of these technologies are actually listing? So, we can go across and the energy spectrum and start talking about the innovation that a lot of these areas do have, and ways that they're trying to be better for the environment, and recognize that each one of their areas have impacts. And one of the interesting things, is you start looking at the wind turbines and the impacts that they would have on the birds, and so the wind industry is really looking at ways that they can mitigate some of those impacts, and start saying, instead of those big wind turbines, how can we provide innovation in this area to reduce the impacts to the birds? You start looking at solar and some of the stuff that is happening there, and the mercury that's in there, and how can we start making, improve this? Not one of the energy sectors kind of sits still and says, this is the way we've done it for 100 years, or this is the way we've looked at it. There's always that migration forward. There's always that, let's use innovation. Let's look at technology. Let's look at how we can do things that are better for the environment. When it comes to oil and gas, you start looking at what's happening, and some of these ways to extract from the oil sands, they're trying to reduce the tailings ponds. They're trying to reduce impacts to the environment and things that they could do. So, some of the companies are looking at ways to take water out of the process, or utilize wastewater in Fort St. John. So you start looking at what's happening there. So they're not taking our fresh water supply. They're actually recycling old water that would normally not be reused in some cases, creating an economic opportunity for some of the municipalities as well as some of the First Nations that are there. You start looking at mining sectors and things that are happening, and it's very exciting to start realizing that these energy companies are also looking at the innovation and technology. So when, as First Nations, we start talking about, we're concerned about the impacts to the environment, some of these companies are so savvy to say, we realize that this is a concern, and it's a concern for us as well. And so one of the things that we're doing is X, and so they start talking about ways that they've engaged. So, the way that we sought for oil and gas 50 years ago is not the same. We've tried to look at ways that we can better incorporate things to realize that we have future generations behind us, and so how can we start making sure that what we're doing doesn't impact the land, the environment, and things moving forward for them.